Hardy paints a world that has no grace in it. It's like he gets almost everything right except grace, because if there had been grace, if he believed in grace, if his characters had access to grace, the ending could have been so different. And I think that's what he gets right. He paints a picture of a world without grace, but we know grace, and we, you know, that's the message that we can offer, where we can pick up where Hardy left off and say, but God.
The last verse in the book of Judges says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever seemed right to him." In the world we live in, it can often feel like that. Our personal experiences, the daily news, and the media are testament to that. The fact that the world is broken and sinful was not a foreign concept to Thomas Hardy, the author of Tess of the DUrbervilles. And so he deals with many difficult subjects as a result of that. One of the subjects which we will talk about today was sexual assault. Though we've spoken carefully and redemptively about this on the podcast today, if that's a subject you know you particularly struggle with, this is simply a disclaimer to make sure you know and can make an informed decision going forward. We hope this episode will be an encouragement to you. Grace and peace. Hi there, my name is Adsum, and this is the Consider the Ravens podcast. We believe that discipleship should happen primarily within the context of the local church, but that the principal way that has been bolstered throughout church history is through literature. Whether fiction, non-fiction, from letters to works of systematic theology, literature helps us to understand the word and to get to know the world we live in. Today, it is our pleasure to have Karen Swallow Pryor with us. Welcome.
It's wonderful to be with you, and your mission and purpose that you just described is like my life mission and purpose. This is so exciting. I love your vision.
I'm really glad to hear that. That's genuinely such an encouragement, especially if you want to play a game at home and really test your limits. You might want to just hold your breath while I give the introduction of what Dr. Pryor does, because I think that would be quite the challenge. I'm going to try and do it in one breath. Dr. Pryor is a research professor of English, Christianity, and culture at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. Crikey, that's a mouthful in itself. She has authored multiple books, such as On Reading Well, and many which are basically readers' guides of different books throughout literary history. She's also the podcast host of Jane and Jesus, discussing Jane Austen and her writing with weekly guests, currently going through Pride and Prejudice, which, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you'll know that we love too. Her writing has been published in multiple places, including Religion News Service, Christianity Today, and she lives with her husband in Virginia. Is there anything particular that I missed?
No, that you covered the bases really well. Thank you.
No problem.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so this week we are going to be talking about Tess of the DUrbervilles, which is Karen's book that she released yesterday. Well, we're actually recording this about a month early, but if you're listening to this, she did release it yesterday. And with the release, she has, with the book, she has an introduction to it and the author, Thomas Hardy. So in this book, she guides you through by helping you to examine and question the book for yourself. So it is worth noting, just before we do a bit more of a deeper dive on this episode will obviously have spoilers for the book. But I mean, you did have about 200 years to hear spoilers. So as you can tell, on this podcast, we've been going for a while. We chat a lot about books and what we can learn from them. And we have Karen here because she basically knows everything. Isn't that right?
Not even close, but I will share the little I know.
Well, we're quite happy just to sit here and listen to you and learn as much as we can from you. So we're going to talk first of all about the author, who is Thomas Hardy. We say a lot about this on the podcast, that often when we talk about the author, we get to know so much more context about the book and what it is that they wanted to talk about. And is there anything, Karen, that you think we need to know about him and what he intends to show through this book before we even start reading it?
Yes, I think it's really helpful to understand Thomas Hardy's life and his vision and his worldview. Anyone who has read any one of his novels, especially his later ones, and Tess is his next to last one, anyone who reads them goes away knowing that he has a very dark, pessimistic vision of life, and some people feel overwhelmed by that. It's very dark. But what is helpful to know about Hardy is that he was so conflicted through much of his life. He was born into a Christian home, as most English people were. He even set his sights early on the church, thought he would become a minister, as many young men did at the time. Even though he did come from a working class, his parents provided for an education for him. And so he struggled, economically, struggled with his social class. And then when he did finally go on and receive higher education, he also struggled with the Christian faith, as many at the time were. And he, like many others, turned to atheism, eventually came around to agnosticism. But what we see throughout so many of his works, including his poetry, because he was first and foremost a poet and then turned to writing novels, we see him questioning God, even when he says he doesn't believe in him. We see him despairing over suffering and human injustice, which is one of the great themes, as we'll see in Tess of the D'Urbervilles, is injustice. And so, he's been described as, and I'm sort of paraphrasing here, is angry at the God who isn't there, right? So there's a paradox there. So he can't quite seem to settle on whether he thinks God exists or not, but he is angry with that God for what he sees in the world around him. He's also angry at the church and Christian society because of its hypocrisies and shortcomings and double standards, as we'll see in Tess. And so his novels come across as dark and despairing, yet what he said himself that he was trying to do is to make society better. He wanted to improve it, and he thought that by showing the shortcomings and the hypocrisies and the failures, that we could become better. So he himself did not see himself as pessimistically as his readers do.
That's so interesting. I think one thing that struck me while I was reading this was the similarity between him and Stephen King. Stephen King is also someone who wouldn't describe himself as Christian, but can't seem to get away from describing everything in a Christian way. Or even when any character describes what they believe or how they believe it in a Stephen King novel, they do it in almost like a creedal way, or a way that sounds almost King James-ish. It just doesn't matter who they are. And it was very much the same in Hardy's thing. Either he's speaking from a Christian perspective, but in parody, or he's speaking against a Christian perspective, even sort of when he doesn't seem to know he's doing it. Would you say that's right?
That's exactly right. And I love that you drew the connection to Stephen King, because I adore Stephen King, and I've never heard anyone really describe him that way. He's always grappling with good and evil, and within a Christian context. Like, he really doesn't seem to be able to get away from the Christian context that has formed him in the same way that it did Hardy.
Yeah, absolutely. This book in particular, why is this book important, despite the fact that it's an important book because it's part of the canon and important for those reasons? Why should we read it?
Well, this book is one of my personal favorites. It has been for a long time, but I didn't just choose personal favorites for the series, although I might have started there, but I chose books that I thought had a particular resonance and importance for the church today in this time. And I've been teaching Tess of the D'Urbervilles for 20 years now. And that means that I have been teaching young people who, in a Christian context, because I have always taught at Christian universities or colleges. So I am teaching Christian young people who are living out the pressures and tensions and failures and hypocrisies of purity culture, for lack of a better term, of who have been confused and felt misled in many times by contradictory messages from the church about sexual purity and what it's for and what it can do and what it can't do for us. And that's not to say that the church has been entirely wrong on this matter. I mean, the church has right teaching on on God's design for human sexuality, but there are things that happen in our culture, in church culture and Christian culture today, that can get the message wrong, just as was true in Hardy's time, that he saw Christian culture kind of getting the message wrong about God's design and purpose for sexuality. So all that to say that this novel is a personal favorite of mine. I have seen its importance and impact in the lives of my students who've struggled with some in their own personal lives with some of the themes in this book. And even more recently, as we have entered a Me Too, Church Too time in the world, it's very important that we understand what happens to women and men who are sexually assaulted and who are not cared for well or at all when they in their societies and in their families. And that's what we see happen to Tess in this story.
So Hardy is very much like a prophet from outside of the church speaking in.
Yes.
We could very much kind of despise him for, well, he's a bit like people described him as quite crass and quite kind of describing things was it a bad story in a crass way or something? Somebody described it as.
Yes.
But the reality is that there will be others in our world right now who are wrestling with those very same things, or at least very similar things from outside of Christianity. How would wrestling with this book help us to interact well with voices from outside of the church who we might not agree with on points of orthodoxy or even their sexual ethic or such the like? How does wrestling with somebody who had a relationship to Christianity like Hardy, how does that help us today?
That's an excellent question, because reading any book like this is practice in doing that very thing. We are reading a book that is critical of, a nominally Christian culture. It's critical of Christian teaching. It's critical of Christian theology. And yet it communicates profound universal truths about the world and the human condition. So as we read it, knowing what we do about who Hardy is and what he believes and what he doesn't believe, we get to practice saying, he's wrong here, but wow, he has some wisdom to offer here. He also develops in us understanding and compassion for the characters. And I don't want to get too far ahead in the conversation, but for the characters in this world he paints. One of the characters that he paints is a genuine, sincere, and not perfect, but noble evangelical clergyman. And Hardy presents him in a sympathetic way so that we can understand his failings, but also his strengths and his desire to do the right thing. And if Hardy, who became an atheist and agnostic and really didn't have much use at all for anything to do anything Christian, if he can understand and portray a Christian clergyman, an evangelical clergyman, at that, in this sympathetic way, then how much better should we who know the Lord and creator of all human beings be able to offer the same kind of sympathy for those with whom we disagree? And that's just one
Amen.
example of what Hardy does for us.
Amen.
I think that's really great. Thank you so much. That was so inspiring. I was sitting here going, oh yeah, that's so true. I loved it. Yes. So before we go on and talk a bit more about the book, you've mentioned a little bit, but what would you say the historical context of is the book? We know that it we can apply this book to our culture today and all the things that and the conversations that were happening right now. But what is the context that he was writing of the book, and why did he feel it needed to be talked about?
So Hardy was living and writing toward the end of the Victorian age in England. And that the Victorian age is rich and wonderful and complicated. And I could say a lot about that. But he was writing at the end of the age when the optimism and sense of progress and hope that marked the middle of the Victorian age had kind of waned. And there had been many things to sort of shake the souls and minds of the Victorian people, including Darwin's theory of evolution, which was really kind of a culmination of doubt and skepticism about the Christian faith, as well as I said before, the growth of atheism and agnosticism. And simply a decline in religious faith, particularly the evangelical faith that had formed the Victorian age. So Hardy is writing out of this skepticism and this doubt, and his primary target in this novel and in many of his other works is the way that Christianity or nominal Christians or Christian culture treated women. Women, he saw, were held to what we would call today the double standard, meaning the sexual double standard that men can do and get away with things sexually that women cannot. He wrote a delightful poem that is humorous, but just devastating in its critique. The poem is called "The Ruined Maid," and in it he has a couple of country girls having a dialogue, seeing one another after a long time apart, and one of the girls still looks like the ruddy, poor country girl that she is, and the other is all dressed in finery, and they're having this conversation. And what has happened is, and the girl who's dressed in this rich clothing and has a wealthy air about her now doesn't even understand what the word means, but what she says is, she says, "I've been ruined." And she says it thinking being ruined is a good thing. What she means by that is she's become a prostitute or a kept woman, but that has elevated her material circumstances to the point that she actually thinks this is a good thing, because she doesn't even know what people mean when they say ruined. And so what Hardy is pointing out is the way that women, they're really their only choice at being even comfortable in life and respected, or not suffering in debilitating poverty, is to be ruined. And so as a social and moral and theological critique of what society teaches women about themselves and their options for living.
Yeah, I think in a very real way throughout this book in particular, there are in some ways only two characters. There is man and there is woman, and they're displayed in lots of different ways. But it's very hard, because I think even in the midst of everything that we've seen and heard of in especially the last few years, it's very easy to go, oh well, those problems aren't our problems anymore. But when you read something like this, you just learn anew that sin is sin, and man is fallen in nature, and it is, and by man here I obviously mean humanity, not just men. But yeah, it's really difficult. Before we talk about the book as a whole, I just want to read two quotes from you, which I just think will really help. We talk a lot about how to read critically on this podcast, and I just think these two quotes will be really helpful for anyone who's about to pick up this book, or indeed any other book. The first one is, "To read well is not to scour books for lessons on what to think. Rather, to read well is to be formed in how to think." And another one which says that in a different way, but just as beautifully, is, "Just as water over a long period of time reshapes the land through which it runs, so too we are formed by the habit of reading good books well." And I just think that would be really helpful.
I'm actually just going to say, after you quoted on reading well, it was really funny. About 2 weeks ago, a lady from church I was talking to, when I said that we do this podcast, she was like, "Oh, there's this really great book that I've read that you should read called On Reading Well." And I was like, "We're about to interview the author."
Oh.
So getting recommendations left, right and centre for you. Anyway, so talking about the book, I thought it would be really great if we started, first of all, just actually, if you have come across any common misconceptions going into the book, or even this book in general within this time period, because we found that we both had some misconceptions, like prejudices that we had towards this book. And then when we actually read it, I was really shocked by how good this book was. But yeah, I want to know if there's anything that you've come across.
It's a book that's so little known actually today that I haven't really come across people who have such prejudices or misconceptions about it. I really want to hear what yours were. The most that I come across is people who maybe read it in high school or when they were too young to really appreciate it, who hated it because it is dark and depressing and it requires a great deal of the reader, just in terms of attention and patience and looking up words that which, well, in my edition I've tried to define most of the hard words. And so usually it's people who've read it once before who just weren't ready for it that I hear from. But what were your misperceptions about it? I want to hear that.
So I will say off the bat that I assumed if the two great genres are tragedy and comedy, I assumed just because most books that I've read from this period had happier endings, if that makes sense, that I was constantly waiting for the happy ending, and okay. which never came. And I know that sounds like a really big spoiler, but it actually is worth saying that if you go and see a tragedy, a Shakespearean tragedy, or read a book, then although nowadays there tends to be either like a moral of the story or a happy ending of some kind, unless you're going to see a Marvel movie now. I guess I tend to expect that. And then secondly, Anna preceded me in this book, and she said there were lots of words that had been described by you. A lot of them are just British words. And so for a lot really of it, we were laughing our heads off about some of the words that you described, where we were like, do you not have these? Like, so
that's so interesting. Oh, right.
So do you not have styles at all?
Not commonly, no.
Right. Okay.
No, I don't even know if we actually, I might only know it from reading British books.
Right. Okay.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting.
It was just interesting because there are a lot of words like that where because we've in England, you're never far from the countryside. Even if you are deep in the center of the city, you're only 45 minutes away. So everyone has gone for a walk in the countryside at some point. And so they would have come across styles and kissing gates and things like that.
Right. That's fun.
Another question separate from that's not connected. But do no houses have names in America? This is off the back of your podcast. You talked about this in episode 1, that you didn't know that houses had names or something like that. And I was like, I thought houses generally had names.
Oh, I don't remember saying that, but it is true. They don't. No, they don't. And I actually wanted, this is like a little personal tidbit that I've never shared before. Since we moved in this house that we live in over 20 years ago, that was built in 1912, I wanted to give it a name, but my husband says that is just too pretentious. So
see, it's, I will say, I thought long and hard about it. This is nothing to do with this this book at all. It's just something I was interested in. I was thinking about this because I grew up in a very very small house which had a name, and even very honey, you might be able to agree or disagree with this, but even like blocks of flats, like apartment buildings that are really run down, will still have some kind of name, like the Ivy Court or the Court of the Roses or something like that, because at least most groupings of houses will have names, even if houses themselves don't. I just found it interesting. That was all. Sorry,
I've always known I was no. Please. I think this is fun, and I've always known I was born in the wrong country, and now there's just one more reason why.
That's so funny. That's really interesting. So those are my misconceptions. I just, for one, I thought it was going to have a happy ending, and second, I guess I expected to know less words than I did, just because I still use all of this language, and that's not even really a joke. I'm
glad. I am so glad to have had this part of the conversation. It's fascinating to me.
Great.
Yeah, in regards to houses as well, I think you'll find if you go to the countryside in England, pretty much all the houses are names. It's a little bit more unusual in cities, but even then in cities it's not pretentious. So you can just tell your husband that actually you're just embracing British culture. And if you live in the countryside, you can just
rural
say
country life. Yes.
Absolutely. Yes. So the two misconceptions that I had about this book. So first of all, I won't say who it was, but someone I knew read it during their GCSEs, and they'd had a bit of experience with sexual assault. And so before reading it, all I knew was, it's this bad book that we shouldn't talk about, because they read it without reading it well. They just took it as Hardy was saying, well, if a woman's been assaulted, even if it's not her fault, then they're bad. And so I came with that perspective, but then also I was told that it was really poetic, and I must admit, I don't like poetry. It's one of the things I've always wanted to like, but no matter how hard I try, I just don't like poetry. And so I was expecting it to be like 5,000 words about a blade of grass, but actually, because I listened to it, I loved it. I found that after like 5 minutes of him describing like the moors, I was just there like, I want to roll down a hill of grass and sniff some trees. And so actually both of the misconceptions that I had were completely wrong. I absolutely loved this book. I was raving about it to Addison for ages, and it's one of the most well-written books that I've read in a while. So I was very impressed.
I really appreciate your sharing what your friend's perception of the novel was, because I can definitely see someone reading a book like this that does give such a heavy judgment through the plot, through the events of the story, on a woman who has been sexually assaulted. And it takes, again, yes, reading well to understand that this is description, not prescription, right? That Hardy is actually criticizing the world that treats her this way. It's easy to miss, but it's so crucial to understanding what he's doing and that's what makes the novel so significant and valuable and important today.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting point during Henry IV Part 2 by Shakespeare, where his heir, Henry V, basically turns around and describes all of the sins that he's committed, and basically says, I know all of these sins, and I'm going to keep doing them for a time because it will make me look even better when I then cast them all off, right? And I feel like most books don't have that obvious yes, this was all wrong moment where they say, yep, get it, that was all a terrible thing, but this is now what I'm about to do, or this is the good thing, or this is the redemptive arc. In fact, reading a book like this can really help us to read a book like Judges, for instance, which is not often explicit about calling out sin. It's not often explicit about saying this this thing that happened is wrong. Instead, it will say something like, they were left to their own devices or something like that. A book like this will just kind of cast it off and say, well, yeah, unfortunately she didn't speak to this person, or unfortunately she didn't hear this, or unfortunately she didn't, or whatnot. I think, yeah, when we read these books or books like this, we'll go, okay, if I think this is wrong, there's a good chance that the author knows that. Right. If that makes sense. Like, and
he wants you to think that, he wants you to recognize the wrongness. Yes,
exactly. I think it was interesting. I alluded to Marvel a couple of years ago when Avengers Infinity War came out, which I realize is a very different thing than we would usually be talking about on this podcast or a similar thing. Essentially, a lot of people really felt quite as if the big bad guy Thanos had done the right thing, because he won in the movie. If you haven't watched it yet, then it's spoilers, but that's fine. But essentially he wins the film, and it's this big twist of a moment where everyone's expecting the Avengers and the Marvel heroes to gang up and win the end of the day, but instead Thanos wins. And I think what we found after that was people going, oh, well, he must have been right then. If he won the film, if he won the story, if he won the end of the day, then the bad guy must be right. And I think that, again, that's one of those things where, because we're assuming a happy ending, we assume that the authors know what they're doing, and that what they know what they're doing is making the good guy win. And so if we read a book like this and go, oh, well, all these bad things happen, and bad things happen in the end, and bad things happen consistently during this book, then the author must mean all these bad things are the things that he thinks are good, rather than going, no, it could be very much parody, or it could be saying, look, these are the things that go on in society. If you read your newspapers properly, if you listen to the news today, or whatever it is, your broadsheets, then you'd know these things were happening. And how much do you think of this book was drawn from real life, from everything that he was experiencing?
No, that's a good question. There actually is record of Hardy encountering a somewhat similar story in the news, and then using that as sort of the seed of the story. And so that's one of many reasons why it reads in such a realistic way, even though this is another thing people should understand about the story. There is a sort of a mythical element to the novel, right down to the names of the characters, like Angel and Alec, the two main male characters. They carry with them archetypal patterns that they represent, yet at the same time, they're very believable characters. We probably all know people like Angel and Alec, and yet they also are part, the story itself is this huge myth in tragic mode. So it does both things. It's very rooted in real life, the times and places. I mean, there's a long scholarship and documentation of how Hardy created a world with names that is based literally on the real places in England where he grew up and walked, and he knew very well. He knew how long it took to walk from one place to another. So it's rooted very much in the real world, but he sort of creates stories that transcend that particular time and place. Can I add something to what you were talking about in terms of when we misunderstand an author's judgment? Like, is he endorsing or critiquing? This happens a lot when people read the Bible. So many people, especially those who maybe want to push against or, be cynical or critical of the Bible or Christianity, are making the same mistake when they read the Bible. The Bible doesn't endorse everything that it describes in the Bible. The Bible is asking us to take by reading the whole narrative, to judge the parts and the pieces, just like we do when we're reading a novel. We don't assume that what one character says or one event that takes place in a novel represents the author's view. We have to understand and interpret the vision of the whole, the pieces through the vision of the whole. It's the same thing in the Bible. God isn't including everything in his word because he's prescribing it. Much of it is description. There's a lot of prescription in there, but it's not all that. We have to develop in order to read it well. We have to know the difference.
Definitely. Yeah. I think if you're at home and you're thinking, well, how can I wrap my head around that? I would pick up the book of Ruth and I would sit and take time to listen and take note of all of the things that are said and done by anyone that was meant to belong to God's people, and then juxtapose that with what Ruth is like, despite the fact she's not connected by blood to God's people, even to the point of Boaz kind of going, you know what, I want you to be safe because I don't think you're really safe with these men in my fields, who she should have been safe among. But it's not saying that, well, that's just how men are, boys will be boys. Like it's saying, no, that's wrong. This is not okay. I think that would be a really good place to start. But yeah, thank you so much for, as we say, literature can help us to understand the word and the world we live in. And that's really, really helpful. Did you want to add anything, honey?
No, to be honest, you guys, so much wisdom. I was quite happy just to sit here and listen. The only thing I was going to say is if our listeners are wanting to read this book, how should we as Christians approach it and read it? Is there anything that we need, any themes we need to look out for? Is there anything that you feel like the Bible is specifically counteracting with what he's critiquing? Because obviously he's critiquing a fairly Christian society. So actually, what does the Bible say about it? I've actually asked loads and loads of questions in that one bit, but it's just a bit of an open-ended thing to end.
No, that's an excellent question. And that's exactly why I've written this series and included this book in it, because I lay out some of the big themes in the introduction with no spoilers. And I think we've done pretty well today being very vague about the way the story turns out. It is a tragedy, but there are so many ways a tragedy could end. But also, reading this book with my edition and all of the questions that I include is like having a class with me, or like having a book club, because I ask very pointed questions designed to lead to not only understanding the novel, which is really good and important, but also understanding it from a biblical worldview. We certainly do not want to take Hardy's critique and just leave it there. We want to receive it and ask, what do we do about this? And of course, he saw a world in which really the way I write about this novel in another one of my books, Booked Literature and the Soul of Me, I have a whole chapter on Tess. What I say about the novel there is that Hardy paints a world that has no grace in it. It's like he gets almost everything right except grace, because if there had been grace, if he believed in grace, if his characters had access to grace, the ending could have been so different. And I think that's what he gets right. He paints a picture of a world without grace, but we know grace, and we that's the message that we can offer, where we can pick up where Hardy left off and say, but God.
Absolutely. If you're sitting at home and you're thinking, this book is not for me, it's a period piece, I know what period pieces are like. If you know me at all, I come from a very low working class background. I've not been to university. I'm not somebody who has a breadth of education behind me to try and read this book, nor is Tess. Tess is a character that anyone can read and confide in and be read by, and she is very simple in a lot of ways. Please don't go into this book thinking that you need to understand the complexities of British upper class culture to understand this. You don't need to understand that to read any of Austen's stuff or Bronte stuff or anything like that either. But particularly with this book, this would be a really good place to step in and say, okay, I'm going to start here and see where I get to. There is an excellent reader's guide collection that Karen has brought out, which we've spoken about a lot during this podcast. It came out yesterday. You can go pick that up right now, which will help to just walk you through anything that you're stuck on. If at any point you're like, I don't get this word, I don't understand what's going on here, this book will really help you through that, and also gives you really good questions throughout the book at good points throughout the book to say, let's recap, let's go over this again and see whether we've really understood it, not in a way that stops you from understanding or stops you in your tracks, but almost allows you to take a kind of a mark in the road and go, okay, cool, I can breathe, great, fab, and continue on, and keep reading well. Thank you so much for writing this. It's been really helpful.
Thank you for having me and letting me share about it.
Yeah, we've absolutely loved it. And I will quickly say as well that actually after reading the book, it made me want to have a cow. I was like, I just want to get a cow and get my own field. And so you never know, in a few years' time.
That's the most specific spoiler. Like...
That's so true. Okay, so just to finish off, Karen, where can people find you and where can they find your books? And
people can find a brief overview of my work at my website, karenswallowpryor.com, and they can find me wasting time and trying to post clever things on Twitter at KS Pryor.
I love it. And if you want to waste your time and stalk us as well, then you can find us on Instagram and Twitter. If you just search Consider the Ravens, you'll probably find us. I don't know what the exact handle is. But from us, thank you very much, Karen, for being here. And thank you everyone for listening. Grace and peace.